thank you, God, for the resources, the ideas, and your word and how your spirit is leveraging all of this. And I do pray for our time together that you will speak to us and that you will help us, oh God, as we talk about men's ministry in the church. I pray, God, that you will just bring glory to yourself. Thank you, Lord Jesus, for your goodness. In Jesus' name, amen. Um, I much rather, and I usually prefer in seminars and things like this, I usually prefer interaction and dialogue, going through some content, but then just talking and raising questions and dialoguing a little bit about this. I had a real hard time, not all that hard, but a little bit of a challenge to figure out how to approach this whole deal. Because there's so many things as senior pastors that we're being asked to do, and I identify with you. I've just been pastoring for 2.5 years full time. All the rest of the time was all itinerant stuff full time. And then God called us in 2005, September 2005, to be the senior pastor at our church. Our church is fairly large, and we've got a little less than 60 people on staff. It's now that's counting everybody. That's our janitors and administrative assistants and pastors and everything like that. One of my biggest challenges when I became a senior pastor, to be honest with you, it took me the longest to figure out a rhythm in the church. And there's so many things that you're being hot-wired to do. And even when you have a church of close to 4,000 people or so, there's always people ambushing you, and they mean well. They really do mean well, but trying to leverage your attention to do things. And so if you don't have a good sense of two things, and this is what I figured out, you don't have a good sense of what are the top 3 or 4 things that I need to consistently do as a leader that will get us 80% of the way there, you're going to end up, and I don't care whether it's 5 people in your church or 50,000 people in your church. If you don't have a good handle on those top 2 or 3 things that you need to consistently do, what's going to happen to you is that you're going to end up feeling like a whore, excuse the expression. You're going to end up feeling like you're held hostage to everybody else's agenda. And, whatever they say is the most important thing in the church for you to do, and then you have a meeting with somebody else and he tells you something else that's the most important thing for you to do. So I learned quickly you need to be very clear about what God's mission is for your church and where you need to be. And guys, I would just really push you into that. Yeah, I really, really would push you into that. Then the second thing you need to be really clear about is what is the most strategic way of me approaching what God's called me to do? I think that you really have to pour yourself into leadership development. I think if there are two major things that you should spend most of your time in, is being clear about the mission, vision, values of the church, the top 3 or so things that you need to be about. And then the other thing is that you gotta be reproducing yourself. You cannot have a leadership style that is a cul-de-sac. You know what I mean? Where it all stops with you. Guys, you're going to burn yourself out if you do that. You're going to kill yourself if you do that. You're going to have to think multiplication by everything that you do. You got to think multiplication. It is easier for you to do stuff. It's easy for you to develop a Messiah complex. But, if you don't do those things, what will end up happening to you is that you get frazzled and burnt and all that stuff. So those are just 2 cornerstone things. I want to give you kind of like, I would sort of call them, got 14 perspectives, and I'm just going to click them off. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking. elaborating on each one of these things about the senior pastor's role in men's ministry. Now, I know I just told you got to figure out what is most strategic for you. But I have a bias here, and you'll see this as I go through these things. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2. Now, you gotta understand, Paul wrote this to Timothy, who was the senior pastor of the church at Ephesus. And inside the church at Ephesus, there's a whole lot of things that he was responsible for. A whole lot of stuff. As you read those first two letters, I mean, he had the same stuff we had going on. He had to take care of these folks who were getting off track with these little wives' tales and things like that. Evidently, he was young and had an older group of people in the church that's trying to micromanage him, and Paul was kicking him in his butt about that, saying, don't let anybody despise your youth now. He was really grabbing and saying, you better lead, boy. That's the tone of those two letters. Stir up the gift, guard the deposit. So there was a bunch of pastoral stuff. I mean, he had to appoint leaders and elders and preach and teach and give yourself to. You read those two letters. I mean, it's the same stuff that we have going on today. But he says something in 2 Timothy 2:2 that I think was a strategic statement that he was making to Timothy about the future of his church. And I think we need to pay attention to this. He says, the things that you have heard from me and other faithful witnesses, go find some faithful men, pour yourself into them and commission them to do likewise. I think that was a core strategic statement that Paul was giving to Timothy about ministry. And I think that he was telling him that, I don't want to make too big a deal of this, but everything that you do needs to be leveraged off of that. Everything you do needs to be leveraged off of that. Now, let me back up. I'm going to come back to that verse in the third perspective that I will give you. The first perspective I'm going to give you is this. This may not sound like it's related to men's ministry, but it really is. Guys, don't ever forget that leadership by its very nature is prophetic. Okay? What do you mean by that? What I mean by that is simply this. Leadership is a picture of where things should be, not a reflection of where they are. And your role as a senior pastor is to paint the prophetic reality of the destination. That is the nature of leadership. Leadership is not just about managing processes or making sure the communion cups are filled or making sure the lights are turned on, the doors locked. I mean, you have to do what you have to do. But really, ministry is not about just the spinning of the plates. Ministry is about projecting where things need to be. So a good part of your time as a senior leader there in your church is wrestling with where do we need to be and how does what we're doing right now line up to where we need to be. Okay? And this is important, even as you may not think this is related to men's ministry, but you'll see in a second when I come back to this. You know, what's that reality? Where are we now? How do we line up where we are to get over here? That's all leadership is. At the end of the day, that's all really leadership is. Clear picture where things need to be, mobilizing, motivating, resource generating people to get to where they need to be. That's basically leadership. Now, the second thing I want to say, as the shepherd, along with your elders, you set the priorities and focus of the church. You set the priorities and focus of the church. And that belongs to you. And again, you might have a different church polity. Maybe you have deacons or whatever you want to call it. But, you know, I view a senior pastor as a leader among leaders. And so together, you go before the Lord and you set the priorities and the focus of the church. And that is a sacred trust that you have. honestly, and I'm getting a little bit off script here, but honestly, one of my big concerns about us as leaders is that it is so easy to get pulled away from that. And I think as leaders, you need to protect some time during the week in which you're always thinking about where do we need to be next. And not just reacting, but being proactive about where things need to be. Now, thirdly, being involved with ministering to men is strategically leveraging where things need to be at the church. Now, let me back up a little bit. I would not be saying this about a lot of other ministry in the church, but I think there is a huge theological justification for senior pastors leveraging ministry to men for everything else that needs to take place in the church. And let me just pound the table and weep about this a little bit here. Theologically, it is so. For whatever reason, and I don't mean to sound exclusive here, but for whatever reason, Jesus chose 12 men to build the kingdom on. Secondly, the Apostle Paul established the church, and he traveled with a team of men to build everything that he wanted to be built on. And so, it is not just an emphasis off to the side. It is a strategic statement. And that's also true in terms of every child is born with two broad categories of emotional need. Now, they got more than two emotional needs, but two broad categories of emotional need. Born with the need for nurture, touch, tenderness, that kind of thing. That's a role role primarily, not exclusively, of the mother. Okay. Secondly, every child is born with the need for daily doses of discipline and denial and direction. And that's a role not exclusively, but primarily of the father, of the man. Direction and movement is written into the DNA of what it means to be a man. And the most strategic use of our time, I think, in church, in terms of our leadership, is to make sure, not that we're having a men's ministry off to the side, but that we're strategically leveraging male involvement to impact the whole of the ministry. And that's the way you have to think about this. You're not involved in men's ministry just to get the dudes to go to a PK event or iron sharpen iron thing, or to get them, stop yelling and cussing at their kids and being nasty to their wives. And I mean, those are things, but that's not a big enough vision. What you understand is that strategically, in terms of the future of this ministry and the future of this enterprise right here, we have got to have faithful men, because this ministry, not to the exclusion of women, I'm not saying that, but to this ministry, to a large degree, is going to be based upon the directional impact that men bring to the table. You got to really embrace that. And so as a shepherd, that has got to be close to your heart. It was close to Jesus' heart. It was close to Paul's heart. It's all throughout the Bible. And so I would argue theologically, ministering to men is God's strategy for leveraging the whole in terms of ministry. Okay? That's a huge point. I started to just do the whole thing around that. But that's huge. All right. The third thing, fourthly, let me just say. I think as a pastor, what I would encourage you to do is to be a model of the outcome that you want to see in men's ministry. And by that, I think as a pastor, as a senior pastor, I want to encourage you, in the words of Howard Hendricks, that we be personally involved in the 3-generational model of men's ministry. What do you mean by that? I think all of us need to have these 3 kinds of people in our lives. You've heard it before. It's nothing new. We need to have a Paul in our lives. I think as a senior pastor, you need a patriarch. Paul representing a patriarch in your life. Someone older than you, someone that is speaking into your life, someone that is stirring your heart and nurturing you and helping you. And you need to have that voice that realizes that they've got more in the rearview mirror than they do out of the front window of the car. Okay? They've got a lot of road, and they're the stewards of stories. And you really need that. And I would tell you that go find yourself a Paul. Not necessarily in your church. In fact, it might be, under most circumstances, I would say you may not want to have that person in your church, but you need a Paul in your life. The second thing is obviously is that you need a Barnabas, a peer or a mentor in your life. Somebody that you can walk the journey with, that helps you to have context and balance, that might be at the same place you are, maybe a little bit ahead of you. And it's just an encouragement to you. And then thirdly, you need a Timothy in your life. Somebody that one or two younger dudes that you're pouring your heart into. All right? Now see, here's the point I'm trying to make to you. When you personally are being impacted three-dimensionally like this, men's ministry is not going to be program-driven or theoretical. It's not going to be program-driven or theoretical. You tend to have passion about the things that are impacting your life. That's the point. That's the point. And the way to rip the heart out of anything is to just have a program or a process when there's no heart involvement in it. And guys, you really have to have your own life being transformed by men that you're seeking God with. They're praying for you. They're loving you. You're loving them. You're involved in their hearts and lives. So again, once again, it does not become theoretical. It is real. And when you stand up and talk about it, you're not just talking about something that's detached. You're using personal illustrations. Your own heart has been touched and ministered to. And I can't just stress that enough. Let me just kind of go sidebar here. The lack of authenticity in ministry is an occupational hazard. It's an occupational hazard. Because we have the sheer volume of stuff that we got to crank out. You got to pray on demand. You got to preach on demand. You got to counsel on demand. You got to interact on demand. You got to speak up in meetings when you ain't got nothing to say, but you realize there's a gap in the conversation. So I better say something. And so you find yourself performing all the time. And if you're not careful, you can become terribly disingenuous because there's an experience gap. You ain't experiencing everything you're talking about. So you start sounding hollow and shallow, insincere. You don't mean to. And I think that being involved in personal ministry, particularly men's ministry, will create and keep an authenticity in your own heart and life that's very engaging. It's real. Then practically, the fifth thing that I would say is to keep a clear picture of what a godly man looks like. Okay, let's back up. Let's back up here. In our church, what does a godly man look like? What I mean by godly man, you got to have a portrait of something in your head. What does he do? I mean, what elements are there? And I would wrestle with that. I think some of it might be locally defined. I mean, we can give broad strokes. You come to things like this, you hear broad things, but in your own context, there might be particular issues that you see in the men of your church that really need to be addressed. For example, I pastor a church in a very high end of town. One of the things we have to wrestle with all the time is the distraction of materialism, Jack. We got to wrestle with that big time. All the toys and trinkets and stuff, it is just all a part of life and this set of entitlement assumptions that come with a few extra zeros in your paycheck. So, but I mean, whatever that is, you need to sit down with some key people, brainstorm, what does a godly man look like here? What are the roadblocks we need to remove from him? And so identify those things. And then sixthly, on the heels of that is you need to clearly define success. Okay, we're going to have a men's ministry. How do we know when we're successful? I mean, what are we trying to accomplish? What does that look like? What is it? And by the way, this is true of anything that you would do in a local church. A lot of us fail and get frustrated in ministry, not because what we started out to do was wrong. It's just that we never sat down long enough to figure out, how do we know when we got there? I mean, it's kind of like, oh, okay, all right, we want to do evangelism. Okay, well, what does that mean? All right, you want to do men's ministry. You got a burden for men. How do you know you got one? How do you know you got a good men's ministry? Okay, so whatever it might mean, and it could be numbers, and it may not necessarily be numbers. It could be numbers at an event, but not necessarily. And I'm going to give a suggestion here later on. But whatever it is, you need to wrestle with, how do you know you have reached a target or you're making progress? So define success. And number 7, may I say this to you, please, for heaven's sakes, keep it simple. Keep it simple. One of the big curses of being a pastor of a church is that things gravitate toward complexity. Toward complexity. It's kind of like the old Atlanta airport. Before they built the new airport and opened it, I think it was like, 79 or so, they opened a new airport. The old airport there in Atlanta, Atlanta just got busier and busier and busier and busier. Before you know it, you had all these, it looked like a spider web going out in different ways. It kept adding on here and adding on there and adding on over here and adding on over here. And, it was like a traffic jam on the runway because Eastern Airlines used to have these big old bus things that would come to the gate and take you way across here because it was, and you look at churches that are program driven and they have all this stuff. You have to rip all the stuff away and say somewhere underneath there is a mission. Somewhere down there is a real purpose. And I'm warning you, and you don't have to have a very large church for that. In fact, I would argue that smaller churches can be more complex than larger churches. And the reason why larger churches get big is because they simplify things, believe it or not. It's a weird paradox. And so you have to be careful. Keep it very, very simple. Make sure your steps serve the whole. I just can't communicate that enough. And if you always keep doing what everybody's suggesting you to do, what ends up happening is that you're going to have competing programs and competing things. And, you wake up one morning and you got these silos in your church. Rather than the things feeding the whole. I mean, that happened. That's been our church's history. Wonderful church, wonderful folks. Our church began to grow. The founder of the church, a tremendous Bible teacher, and somebody had an idea. Well, yeah, release them, let them do the idea. Well, that was great in the early days, but as more and more people start coming, okay, now you got a ministry over here, and this person on this high capacity volunteer or staff person is owning this ministry over here. Then you got another ministry over here. This high capacity volunteer is owning this ministry over here. Then you got another ministry over here. So the church became a coalition of people doing whatever they wanted to do, and they were seeing some success. But you wake up one morning and go, how does this leverage where we're going? You're telling me don't mess with me because I'm doing this over here, but how is this feeding this over here? And so I want to encourage you that no matter what you do, okay, leverage men's ministry, but keep it very, very simple. Keep what you're doing very clear. And make sure they're clear feeders into the overall vision. Okay? The men's ministry needs to know that they exist to feed something bigger than themselves. Our vision at our church is very simple. Very, very simple. Very simple. It's maturity in Christ. Colossians 1:28. Know, experience, and serve till we'll all become complete in Christ. And everything we do in our church has to feed that vision. Okay? Or else we don't do it. They have to have these 4 things by which they have to lead with the Word, have to lead with intentional equipping, have to lead with spiritual passion, okay? And you have to lead with intentional shepherding. People need to know that they're being cared about. But there has to be a sense of movement. You got to tear down cul-de-sacs. All right, so keep it simple. Now, number 8, don't think programs, events, or process first. Okay. Always think mission first. Don't think programs, events, or processes first. One of the things that you're going to run up against with dudes, as men, we tend to be very action-oriented. We like activities. Well, that's okay. I think the activities are wonderful. I think, going fishing with the guys, going to play golf with the guys, having a barbecue is great, and having the Saturday once a month men's breakfast, that's super, and this kind of thing. But, always say, for what? For what? For what? Keep the for what out there. And our big problem as men, because we have a tendency toward activity, the activity can become the default purpose. And so you have to keep it clear. Don't think programs, events, or strategy or process first. Always think for what and mission first. Number 9, I should have said this earlier, enlist people to pray. Anything of lasting value comes out of heart burden. Enlist people to pray, to seek God for the men of the church. Okay, now here's where I'm going with all this. Number 10 is the biggie for everything. You forget everything else I said, but number 10 is a biggie, okay? Keep the focus on discipleship and life transformation. That's the end game. That's the end game. It's no big secret. Your end game for ministering to the men in your church is to get them to embrace discipleship as a lifelong commitment. That's what you're really talking about. And you really want to embrace life transformation. That's where you're going. You want them to be reproducing followers of Jesus Christ. That's the heart. That's why we're going after you. We're not going to let you stay where you are. You got to move toward Christ-likeness. And life transformation and multiplying discipleship is really what you're all about. And don't let the program or anything else clutter that. Let it serve it. Let it serve it. The real meal, the stuff on the plate that represents the program or the events, the stuff on the plate is what's going to feed the dudes. It's discipleship and life transformation. And you got to find out what are the most meaningful ways in which guys' lives are changed and engaged. Okay? So keep the focus on discipleship and life transformation. Now, coming out of that is number 11. Now, you got to wake up for this one. Think movement, not ministry. Think movement, not ministry. What do you mean by that? Okay. Let me give you four things, four elements. If you stop at the first two elements, you will have a nice ministry. But if you go through the next two, it will move from ministry to movement. You got to connect lost men to Jesus. That's really important, okay? And then there needs to be initial discipleship, the strengthening of their faith. Now, you don't really have a movement, though, until you add these other two. The third level is that you got to challenge the men to own God's mission for their lives. That God has written a signature over their souls, and they need to find out what it is. They need to own the mission that God has for them. And then number 4, they need to be reproducing leaders. In other words, what you do has to multiply itself. That's the multiplication component. That's the reason why it's not wise for the pastor necessarily to lead the men's movement. Strategically, your role is to find somebody on the back end that you can reproduce yourself into his life. You're responsible for that climate, but you only have a movement. A movement is when it's self-perpetuating. When people connect with Jesus, they get discipled and they own God's calling. And because they own God's calling, they're reaching out and touching the hearts of other people, and out of that comes leadership. And if this principle of spiritual multiplication is at work in our church, you know, we should never have a crisis of leadership. The crisis of leadership in the local church usually has to do with a deformed thinking about ministry. And if we back up and think multiplication by what we do, think about how do we leverage and how do we push people to the next level, that's when it begins to take on a little bit of a dynamic emphasis in the church. This is particularly true with men. I think strategically, what I would do would be I would suggest, and this is true in our church. No, let me just back up. Well, let me tell you this, and then I'll give you an illustration. I think strategically, one of the things that I would look for would be my criteria of success would be percentage-wise, how many of our guys are involved in some type of small group. I could give a fart about how. Oops, this is being recorded. I mean, I could care. In a certain sense, it wouldn't make any difference the numbers that came to a breakfast or this kind of thing. What I'm looking for, hey, it's great. I mean, you know, all right, we had 300, 400 out this Saturday or whatever it was. That's super good. Okay, but I want to pull and say, okay, man, now, how many of these dudes signed up for a small group? How many of them are in a small group? How many of them are being nurtured? See, that to me, that's more important than that other deal there. And so that's what I mean, that you have to keep your mind on what's most important. When I came, now let me give you this 12th one. I'll tell you a little story about our church. Number 12, which really fits all of this is together. Use programs and events to create momentum for discipleship. Use programs and events to create momentum for discipleship. They are important, but only in terms of the momentum that they create. When I first came to our church has had historically a wonderful emphasis on men. You know, we took hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dudes through the years down to PK events and things. It's been wonderful. But shortly after I got there, I discovered that, and we had just this great event. It was a Saturday breakfast. That was an outreach kind of thing. We would have people with, known in the community, professional athletes, business leaders, this kind of thing would come and speak, and guys would be impacted. I mean, we've had John Smoltz there, and we had a number of other folks. But what we began to discover was that the sizzle was more than the substance. You know what I mean? And it was almost as if the tail started wagging the dog, where you're spending all this time and energy and effort and bringing these people here, leveraging this event and figuring out what you're going to do next, and kind of like what have you done for me lately deal, that we just decided to pull back, and we put a little task force together and say, wait, time out. We really need a movement here. We really, really do. So what we decided was to paint a picture of what is a godly man in our church? What does it look like? This stuff that I'm telling you here. We pulled back and talked about this stuff. And based on that, we just ditched a whole bunch of stuff that we were doing and decided to do 6 men's summits. And I personally am leading those. Now, we're not going to do it this next year because we're developing some leadership, trying to multiply our influence. But 6 men's summits in which we have taken the 6 topics and 6 things that we feel is important for a godly man to look like and to be, and we speak to those things. But our takeaway is that small groups, we drive everything to these guys getting signed up and being part of some type of small group, because life change takes place in the context of community. So we want to keep it simple. We don't want to have this event mindset. And I would even say to you, when you recruit your men to come to things like this or to a Promise Keepers event, before you leave, you identify what you want to do with what they heard when you get back. Don't wait till the event. Think in terms of ahead of time. Okay, all right, now how are we going to leverage this stuff? How are we going to help these guys follow through on what God's speaking in their hearts about? And that's the role of a senior pastor, just to tweak it. So you use exposures to leverage your own ongoing movement. And don't just think because you invited them to come and they came and they bought the stuff that, okay, I've done my job. Now, we need to shepherd them. Shepherd them toward the desired end and goal. Does that make sense? Yeah, and it's just a, guys, what I discovered, and I ain't telling you anything you guys haven't heard, probably said it better than me. I ain't said one thing here, but sometimes what I've discovered in my life, the difference between just kind of going along and doing stuff and explosive impact is not like A to Z or even A to L. Sometimes it's a quarter turn of thinking. Just that little flip of this, just a little clarification of expectations. And it's not my notes, but let me throw this out to you too. What you'll discover is, after a while, people will respond to you based upon how you project you want them to respond to you. If that makes any sense. That's huge. Your leadership, if you continue to operate and develop a style that's driven by multiplication, after a while, people will know that you're not going to own all the deliverables. And you can do it by a very simple thing. Whenever somebody comes to you with an idea that's even a great idea, and you say, well, that's a marvelous idea. That's great. That's super. How do you think you ought to get that done? Well, Pastor, I'm coming to you. No, that's a wrong expectation. I mean, maybe it's a calling that God's placed on your heart. And when you start operating and placing ownership back on the hearts of people, it is amazing how some of that pressure just comes off of you. A friend of mine told me this over 20 years ago. said, Crawford, never forget people treat you the way you let them treat you. He wasn't saying that in a negative way, but it's just really true. And I think there's some habits as leaders that we need to learn how to project. I've said this, number 13. Use your leverage and influence, but reproduce leaders. That's what I'm saying. There's a little nuance. Use your leverage and influence, but reproduce leaders. It is true. There's only some things that you can speak to, and you got to use that. You got 6 silver bullets and 24 targets. Be careful of expending your ammunition on stuff that's not leveraging. Think about it. But use your leverage and influence, but make sure that you're reproducing leaders. And the last one is this. Don't just import stuff into your church because it's working somewhere else. One size doesn't fit all. And this whole plug and play stuff, you got to know your people. You got to know your church culture. You got to know the issues that your men face. And certain principles are always transferable, but differentiate between the principles and the practices. Some practices won't work where you are. Some of the stuff that works where we are won't work where you are. I mean, Atlanta's a weird place, and there are things that happen over there that just won't, indifferent ain't wrong, it's just different. So you got to be discriminating and extract the stuff that's principle-based and that you can put the clothes of your people on and where you are. And, I know the deal of comparisons, you hear people tell stories at these places like this. A guy like me tells stories, you hear about sizes and all this stuff, and this tendency to compare, and you're getting, well, we don't have these resources that they have, or we can't do this. Well, you need to drop all that stuff. Find out where your people are, what you're calling there. Can these principles work? But don't plug and play stuff, okay? That's the dangerous thing. I just think all these people, all these years ago, everybody was trying to be Bill Hybels, and they'd make their pilgrimage up to, to Willow Creek, and they'd come back and try to do everything that he did it the way he did it, and it would be like a C- or a D+. Because, what the terrible assumption that they made was that they could replicate all of that, but you can't replicate anointing. That's a little minor detail. You can't replicate that. So you got to figure out what your calling and anointing is, and then figure out, take the principles, but put it in your own wardrobe. Well, let's stop right there. And I don't even know if this has been helpful or not, but any questions?
In your church, as a pastor,
Mm-hmm.
in your church, you got a big church, and probably you do have somebody that is in charge of the men ministry in your church.
Yes, yeah.
So having that and having somebody that is in charge of the men's ministry, what is your role?
I stay close to it. Well, we have a little bit of a different situation. We have an adult ministries pastor, okay? And I speak into the whole. Like when we had this task force, I was pretty close to all of that. Speaking into the rails that we're going to run on, and looking very closely at the directional stuff, and making sure that my heart was a part of that. But I don't get in their way, though. See, I stay close to what's being done and how we're going to do it. And each one of these summits, I'm pretty close to that too. So, even though there's a guy that directs it, our configuration is we don't have a full-time men's ministry leader. That's on purpose. We made that decision. We don't have a full-time person that does that. Our adult ministries pastor is close to the leadership team of volunteers, and the director, the leader of the men's ministry, stays on board for about 2 years, and then we flip it around, and it comes out of a group in our church, a committee. So what we're trying to do is that together influence their thinking and bring them in line with where we're going overall as a church, so that what they're doing is feeding that and helping them to clarify that. But we have an empower and release philosophy at our church. You know, we want people to really be free to own their ministry. And so, but that, I mean, we set direction. It's not random. And so that's how we go about it. You know.
All right, small groups, you were saying, you know, making sure that they're in small groups. By that meaning that you break, let's say if you have a men's fellowship of 300, all right, so what you assign maybe 10, so you break those 300 men, you break them into small groups?
Yes, yeah, you break them up into small groups. You have, you can either do it geographically or whatever, and you train the small group leaders, and you take them through a curriculum or something, you know, and there are many excellent Bible studies or whatever. Here's the deal. The big takeaway is not so much the curriculum that you take them through, but having them commit to the process of discipleship and development. That's the takeaway. And so, you know, you break them up in the small groups, and you don't want a group any more than 10. You know, so. Yeah.
I'm a pastor, and my church is running maybe 67.
Uh-huh.
You know, been pastoring 8 years right now. And so a men's fellowship, you know, I head up a men's fellowship.
Yes.
I have 2 other guys that are, you know, to my right hand that I'm trying to lead them on.
Yeah.
In the hopes, you know, that they'll grow, mature, prove themselves, character, you know, integrity.
Right.
To lead. But I'm always involved. Like,
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? Plus, I also look at myself. I'm a man. I need ministry.
Absolutely.
So I'm not just a pastor trying to lead them. As a man, I know I count myself as a man just like they are.
Yeah.
Because I'm not looking just to minister to them. I also look forward in them ministering to me.
Yeah.
You know
Exactly. And, you know, one of the things, and I know we all know this, but never, ever, 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 ever underestimate the power of visibility. Don't ever underestimate that. And I know we know that, but, you know, the fact that they see you there. I mean, if I'm almost always at our men's stuff, you know, rare exception that I'm out of town or whatever, but almost always there. And that says something. Yeah. Communicates value.
Yeah, and that was my leading to you, and you just finished answering it. Because I know I don't foresee ever, even if I was to find people that will run my men's ministry, that I ever see myself then pulling away from that. And then, well, you know, that's been taken care of. And I think that's what happens to us as pastors a lot of times, is that pastors want a great men's ministry, but the pastor is not involved in that men's ministry.
Yeah.
So the men's ministry they don't really know the pastor. The pastor don't become vulnerable with them.
Right. And, you know, I do get the thing that, you know, as a pastor, you don't own your time. I mean, there are things that happen all the time that, and there are little nuances of things, and not everything is cut and dry. But I would say, no matter how many members you have at your church, if you have 50,000 people there, I think to be involved in men's ministry and to be seen is really very, very strategic. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
How do you develop your core, as you talk about faithful men, not just the men's ministry, but your leadership in developing those core people that would lead your men's ministry? What is your process?
Well, actually, we're just trying to identify all of that ourselves right now, to be honest with you. We have ongoing, we have a track for like our leadership development with our church in terms of, you know, how do you move people along, particularly spotting people who are elder quality folks and this kind of thing that we have. And we're nurturing our younger staff and stuff in-house. We've got some things that we're doing to help spot that development. And I've just commissioned. We just asked. It's interesting. We just asked 3 guys in our church these are guys that are passionate about leadership development. That the Lord, they've been in our church for I don't know how long. They're actually with a mission agency, and just had a meeting with them 2 weeks ago. We need a macro strategy for our church for intentional leadership development that will cut across the congregation. And so, to be honest with you, we're not completely there yet. Now, having said that, though, one of the marvelous things about our church that I really, the founders did a great job. There is a culture of discipleship there. So, and we have a lot of small groups there. And so there's some of that that's happening virally. You know what I mean? It's all a part of that. And so, you know, that's kicking itself up. So maybe next year we'll be further down the road on that systemically, but we're not quite there yet. Yeah.
What's your said you had the 6-man summit, 6 topics which you look for in a godly man. What was y'all's church?
Let's see if I can remember them. I was afraid when I mentioned that. I thought to myself, I can't remember this. I think a man in his work, a man in his family, a man in his walk with God, a man in his morality, a man in his life choices, and the man in his involvement in church. Now they're fancier titles that our team has come up with when we, but that's the heart of it. Oh yeah.
Some of your terminology
Yeah.
rings true.
Yeah.
I grew up in Atlanta, and I've never been to North Point,
Yeah.
East Stanley's church, but some of the things they've been able to do there
Yeah.
through that expose in that book was pretty fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
If you haven't read Simple Church, I would urge everybody to read it.
Absolutely. Very, very good book.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, if you read the first 100 pages of it, it's probably you'll get the heart of the book. But it's really great. Andy's a wonderful friend, and it sounds strange. I said it earlier. This is a weird paradox. One of the reasons why some churches grow really big is because of the very simple. It's an interesting dynamic. Andy probably is one of the most focused people I've ever met in my life. They don't do, there's a lot of stuff, you'd be surprised at stuff that they don't do. I don't think they do gender-related ministries, women's ministry, men's ministry. They don't do any of that. They do none of that. I happen to believe in doing gender-based ministry. Our calling's different. Ours is more a discipleship thing. His is more focused on, really it's more of an evangelistic outreach kind of thing, and so it makes sense for his calling. But they're just like that. And there's something to be said for keeping things uncluttered.
In you saying that, because sometimes I look at myself, and I thank God for the relationship between me and the Lord. And because you know how is it that sometimes your mind, you don't want to, but your mind usually drifted and takes away. My God, a church 100 ministries, 200 ministries, and this and that, and sometimes you may feel like, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
This. And so, in saying that, and then again, everybody has their own fingerprint. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Their own calling. So, and I believe in simplicity. That's what I always try to put also before the church. It's like the saying said, keep it simple, stupid.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So when you look at these churches and so on and so forth, it's not so much how many ministry you have, but is the quality of the ministry that you as a church, correct me if I'm wrong, the quality of the ministry that we as a church are doing to our people.
Yeah, and then there's another thing. Yes, but there's another deal here. I think we're seeing there's a whole paradigm shift that we have to have. The way we do church. We can't do church the way it was done the last 30 years. You just can't do it that way anymore. You're never going to have a staff large enough. You can't do it that way. So I really believe that if we're going to be dynamic and really have an impact on our communities, we have to flip the script in terms of how we do church. We have to stop thinking that all service has to be generated by the church. All ministry opportunities have to be generated by the church. You got to get that out of your mind, and you have to keep what Our deal is that we just do like 4 things at our church. There's only 4. We only do like 4 macro things. Okay, we're worshiping. All right, we're equipping, we're discipling, and we're serving. We're serving inside and we're serving outside. All right, and that's all we do. And you don't get it all cluttered. And validate people who want to serve outward. In fact, you push them out there. We're creating a culture in which we're saying, God has given you vision and ideas. We don't need to raise the money for that. You don't need to have the church's budget for that. And it's a valid thing. We're going to hire a releasing pastor whose major job is to help people along with their own vision for impacting, and that is wonderful. And I think we just need to cut down on the amount of stuff that we do centrally in the church and just flip it all around. But you need to change your expectations about that. And so I think the era of a church putting on its website, the 137 ministries that they have, I don't, to me, frankly, that doesn't mean much. It's the issue is, are the people in the church, are they Colossians 1:28 and Ephesians 4 people, who are equipped to serve, and they're out there doing it. And I just think we just need to think dynamic. Numbers are overrated. Having 100 people who are salt and light and impacting the cause of Jesus Christ is far greater than having 4,000 people who are sitting there with hemorrhoids because they're just listening and, they're being anonymous and they're a bunch of, bloated Bible brains. They're not doing much with their lives. And so I think, we just need to revisit our criteria and think in terms of impact and those kind of, that's a soapbox with me these days. I just think that, we look at these guys across the country and we want to build huge places like that. We just made a strategic decision. We have about, there's like 35 plus folks, 3,500 plus folks that call it fellowship home. And we're growing in terms of attendance and all that stuff. We just made a decision as elders that we're building a new sanctuary, and we made a strategic decision. The new sanctuary, now check this out, the new sanctuary will seat probably a little less than 2,000, and that's on purpose. That's on purpose. It's on purpose because it's going to drive what we want to have a few multiple sites, but more than that, we want to do church planting. And we want to spin people off. And so our vision is not to build some huge structure, but really to multiply the impact and influence. And I just think everybody needs to come to grips with, there's 2 ways of building ministry. 2 ways, okay? 2 ways. It's very simple. And both of them are very successful. You can build a ministry around a platform, around a person with extreme gifts, great verbal, public abilities, this kind of thing. You can build a ministry that way, and it happens all the time. Happens all the time, and I'm not knocking it, whether it's Charles Stanley or his son or others, Rick Warren, whatever. You can build a ministry based upon someone that is visionary and is the articulate spokesman person. Or you can build a ministry based upon multiplication. And I would submit to you over time, the ministries that are built on multiplication will have the greatest impact, even in terms of numbers. So, and I think every pastor needs to make up his mind what he wants to do. Now, I've got I'm not falsely humble. I know for whatever reason, God's given me some verbal skills and this kind of thing. And I know that, people come because of that. But that's not my philosophy of ministry, though. My philosophy of ministry has never been that way. I want to use that to leverage multiplication, because that's what it's all about. So, yeah.
Talking about multiplication, and as you multiply, how do you keep the quality and the succinctness of your vision as you multiply down from yourself into either your staff or your lay leaders, and so on and so forth?
You just answered it the way you phrase it. You spend your time with the leaders. Part of the part of nurturing the vision is they're going to do things differently, and the other side of movement, the risk with the movement is that it's messy. Okay, and you're going to have some casualties, but it's still worth it. Okay, but excuse me, I think what you do is that you create strategic alignment, philosophical heart alignment. You don't try to manage the how-tos. You cut people free on that stuff. They're going to do it differently. But you make sure, okay, here are the 3-4 things that's on my heart that makes me pound the table and weep. And the signature has to be on it. Example is our student ministries. We just revamped our entire student ministries there. It had gotten, frankly, into, I don't want to go into too much detail being recorded here, but at any rate, I sat down there's a task force of elders and stuff that came alongside of our student ministries pastor, and said, we really need to revamp this whole thing here, because it wasn't lined up to our vision. And so I took those 4 things that's true of all of our ministries. I added a 5th one there, and said to the guy that's leading it up, okay, and I had only been in there about a year and a half when we did this. So I said, okay, now here's the deal. I don't care how you go about what you do. You know the vision of the church, and here are the 5 things that student ministries you're going to have to lead with. You're going to have to lead with these things, and I got to have buy-in from your heart and mind. Lead from the word, equipping, spiritual passion, intentional shepherding, and with them, generational connection, where it is parents' involvement in the kids and this kind of thing. And my challenge was, that's it. Now, if you can't do that, then God's called you to minister elsewhere. I wouldn't fire him or being hard, but I was just trying to let him know that this is this is it. Okay? And I said, now you got freedom on all the other stuff. I don't care what you're doing there. I don't care how you can have perforated ears and torn jeans, and I don't care about any of that. Turn off all the lights, do whatever you want to do. But Jack, these 5 things. So I think that's how you get the buy-in, is that you have to identify clearly, okay, you're going to wear different clothes, you're going to talk differently, you're going to do things differently, but here's the stuff that if you're going to be a part of this team here, you're going to have to lead with these things. So identify that first, and then you manage over against mission, not over against activity. And that's where sometimes leaders make a big mistake. You hold people to the fire based upon alignment to mission. And you don't micromanage them on the other stuff. Now, you let other people do that. They're just being there on time, things like that is other stuff. But as a leader up here, you're more concerned about this other stuff. Okay. Yeah.
Restate the expectations of leaders where you just added the 5th.
Yeah, it's very, you guys do this all. I ain't telling you nothing new here. It's these, lead from the scriptures. I ain't talking about being backdoor. You lead from the Bible, okay? You lead from the Bible. And spiritual passion. By that, what I mean, calling people to making some spiritual life choices and decisions, the lordship of Jesus. And that, God has a plan for you. And don't be afraid to call people to a higher deal. Intentional equipping. They need to be given skills to know how to share their faith, to understand Scripture and impact and how to have ministry. 4th, intentional shepherding. They need to know that you love them and that there's a heart connection there. And the 5th one is generational connection. We don't want any us and them. You don't be protecting these kids from their parents in a negative sense. You know, we need to have connection there.